Engineering conversation and innovation. This is Schulich Connects, proudly sponsored by TD Insurance.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Anders Nygren. I'm the Vice Dean of the Schulich School of Engineering, standing in this morning for Bill Rosehart, our Dean. It's my pleasure to welcome you this morning to the first Schulich Connects event of 2024. Our topic this morning is Engineering Energy Solutions, and this event is proudly sponsored by TD Insurance. Before we get underway with our event, I'd like to just take a moment to acknowledge the traditional territories of the peoples of Treaty 7 here in southern Alberta. This includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, the Piikani, and the Kainai First Nations, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bears Paw, and Goodstoney First Nations. And the City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. So Alberta is well known as the energy province, and we have a long history in oil and gas. We've also become a global leader in the research and development of new energy resources, such as hydrogen or geothermal energy. The Schulich School of Engineering and our province are in a perfect place to meet the ever-growing need for clean and renewable energy to power our homes, our businesses, vehicles, and more. And our panel today will discuss the past, the present, and the future of energy and engineering in Alberta. So before I pass it over to our speakers, just some quick logistics. There will be an opportunity to ask questions later on in the program. And for those of you here in person, please hold your questions, and at that time, a mic runner will be coming around the room so that you can ask your questions of the panelists. And for our virtual guests, please email your questions to ssemc@ucalgary.ca. I'm sure we'll get that email address on the slides here in a minute as well. So with that, I'd now like to take a moment to introduce you to our moderator, Dr. Kerry Black. Dr. Black is an assistant professor in the Center for Environmental Engineering Research and Education and the Department of Civil Engineering here at the Schulich School of Engineering. She received her PhD from the University of Guelph, with her research focused on sustainable water and wastewater management in Indigenous communities. Dr. Black holds the Canada Research Chair in Integrated Knowledge, Engineering, and Sustainable Communities. Her current research focus is on creating sustainable infrastructure for healthy and resilient communities. So I'd now like to pass things over to Kerry, who will introduce us to today's panel. Kerry, over to you.
Thanks so much, Anders, and good morning, everyone. I want to acknowledge, too, the beautiful territory of Treaty 7 that we're on that warmed up a little bit yesterday, thank goodness, or maybe not, depending on if you have gone skiing this year. You might be asking yourself, why is some rogue water wastewater engineer moderating this energy panel? And I'm happy to tell you that there is a reason. It wasn't that I was the last person or the first person to say yes. When this panel got started, Dr. Roman Shore had the idea of bringing together a discussion on this topic. He decided it was too cold here in Calgary and went to Texas, to which we all said, have fun. We'll be here. So unfortunately, he couldn't moderate, and we've worked together, the geothermal research lab that Roman started a couple years back. I do work in energy, but on the periphery, I would say, more working at the community level on sustainable energy futures. So that is why they allowed a civil engineer to moderate today's panel. I asked nicely. So I want to give you as much time to hear from our panelists as possible, because you did not come here to hear me ramble on. You came here to hear these wonderful panelists. It is a very timely discussion, especially if you just happened to drop in and listen into some news yesterday covering new changes, the lifting of a moratorium, and also the imposing of some restrictions to renewable energy. So we have a pretty hot topic to discuss today. I can't promise you that it's not political, because it is. So that's my only red flag for you today. We do our best to share our perspectives. It's an open, safe space. But obviously this topic is heated. It does get political. It does get pretty dicey at times. But lucky for you, we have these three fantastic speakers who are going to share their perspectives today, some even on the news just as recent as yesterday. So first, directly to my left, we have Dr. Agre Mwesije. I have been practicing the pronunciation of your last name. How did I do? Not bad? I'm working on it. Good. I didn't get great. That's like a C- in my class. Okay. That's all right. We're going to get there. He's going to correct me in just a second. Dr. Agre has just joined the university a year and a half ago,
2.5 years.
2.5?
Yeah.
Stop it right now.
Yeah.
Sorry, COVID brain. I think everything was yesterday. He's an assistant professor in mechanical engineering in Schulich School of Engineering with a strong focus in sustainable energy systems. He previously did his postdoc at Ryerson University and covers a bunch of topics, including modeling, design, optimization of sustainable thermal energy. Dr. Moisije, thank you for coming.
Yep. Thank you. Pleasure.
Directly to his left, I have Dr. Sarah Hastings-Simon, an associate professor in the Department of Earth, Energy, and Environment and cross-appointed in the School of Public Policy at the University of Calgary. Dr. Hastings-Simon is a macro energy system researcher and directs the Master of Science program in Sustainable Energy Development and is co-founder and co-host of Energy versus Climate, a webinar and podcast that explores the energy transition here in Alberta and also beyond. She's also the chair of the Panel for Clean Growth with the Canadian Climate Choices Institute and sits on the board of the directors of the Pembina Institute. Thanks so much for coming, Sarah.
Thanks for having me.
And then directly to the left there, we have Brian, and I'm probably going to mess this last name up as well. That's why my last name is just black. Brian Helfenbaum.
Nice.
Hey, I'm doing a little bit better now.
A+.
They're letting me stay in school. Brian is Associate Vice President of Clean Energy at Alberta Innovates, holds a bachelor's degree in environmental engineering from the University of Waterloo, and a master's degree in business administration and a specialization in global energy management and sustainability from the University of Calgary. He oversees programs in clean tech and advanced hydrocarbons with key initiatives in hydrogen, digital energy, methane emissions reduction, energy storage, and bitumen beyond combustion. Brian has been a theme lead for the Clean Resources Innovation Network and a fellow and ambassador with Energy Futures Lab. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you.
They're each going to give you a little bit of a sense of who they are as we start off the panel today, but we wanted to ease you into this discussion today. We do have about 25 minutes together on this panel, and then we have an additional 20 minutes for questions. It tends to be somewhat of a quieter space for questions, so I'll tell you what I tell students in my classroom. You get 1% extra at the end of the year for every question that you ask. I'm sure you're really looking forward to that. So please try and come up with some good questions for our panelists. So what I want to do first to start us off is ask all of our panelists to share their perspectives on where they think we are right now. So we know that energy transition is here. We know that it's a topic that we are constantly discussing both here at the university, in industry, private sector, public sector, media. We can't necessarily get away from it. So we want to hear from each of you on what you think is happening right now, where you think we're headed, and what you think the key issues that we're facing. And I'm going to start first with Agre.
Thank you. Great to be here and talking about energy and sustainability and transition. So looking back at us as a country, we are lucky to have such a space where we have a large landmass, few people, but of course we have a challenging climate. So our climate requires that we use a lot of energy. So most of our energy that we are using goes to things that have to do with heat. This is the same thing globally because heat accounts for about 50% of the global energy use. Things like space heating for our buildings, residential, commercial, industry, heavy industry in mining, oil and gas, and so on. So in terms of energy transition, we have had a period where we are looking at reducing the emissions as set by the Paris Agreement. We have made commitments to reduce emissions. First was 30%, and then later on enhanced to 45%. Unfortunately, we are not making fast enough progress for us to be able to reach the targets if we continue on the trend that we are on. So between 2015 and 2022, the emissions reduced by about 7.4%. Most of that reduction came from retiring coal power plants in Ontario, but there was a lot of increase in emissions that came from increased production of oil and gas. So our energy system is still broadly based on fossil fuels. So about 77% of the energy that we use, the total energy supply, is still based on fossil fuels. If we talk about the electricity that we use for different applications, we have about 82% of the electricity produced comes from clean energy sources, which is a good thing. I think we are comparable to most countries that are making progress in reducing emissions by electrifying their grids and also looking at other ways of utilizing energy. So what that means is that we still have a lot of work to do in terms of looking at the sectors that are contributing to the emissions, fossil fuels, that use fossil fuels. On the electrification side, we have a chance to use electrification as a means to transition to a better and a low carbon economy because our energy comes from clean sources. And hydropower is the leading energy source because we have 7% of the water that we have globally is here in Canada, so that helps us a lot. So we still have progress to make in terms of reducing the emissions. We are still heavily dependent on oil and gas for our energy needs overall, and that's because of the climate that we are living in. So among the challenges that we have to address is how do we make sure that for the climate that we have, the energy that we reduce the energy intensity. This can be things like in our buildings, in our homes, heating and so on. How do we reduce the energy intensity and therefore reduce the amount of energy that we are using for heating, for space heating? We have cost of renewable energy still significantly high. So wind, solar, the costs have significantly dropped, about 80% for solar in the last 10 years, which is a good thing, and that has increased the deployment of solar in most places. In Alberta, we have the capacity is about 8%, if it's all available, of the electricity that we get coming from solar. Wind, about 21%. So if the costs still come down, keep coming down, affordability of the renewable energy resources, then we are going to be in a place where we can say, okay, we are cost competitive with oil and gas, and therefore we can deploy more and more of the renewable energy sources. Yeah.
Thanks, Agre. I'm going to come back to Agre's area of research and a strong focus that you heard there on alternative heating and cooling systems and thermal energy storage. We'll come back to that and learn a little bit more about what Agre's been finding in his research. I'm going to pass it over to Sarah now to get your perspectives on where you think we are right now, where we're headed, and what those key challenges are moving forward.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think we're at really quite a moment of change in energy transition. I've been working kind of in and around this area for almost 2 decades now, and I think there is a sense of, we've been talking about energy transition, and there's going to be energy transition, and we look around, and it doesn't really feel like anything has transitioned so far. And I think that is something that is really about to change and is actually, if we look into the data, starting to change already. And the reason for that, when I think about what drives energy transition, there's really 3 factors that have been sort of the driver for regions, for countries, for governments, for individuals, for companies to change. One, which was mentioned, is these commitments to reduce carbon emission to address climate change, as well as the desire to reduce, say, particulate emission that comes from combustion of fossil fuels in countries as well, too. But that's not the only one. That, along with technical progress, the cheaper that alternative technologies become, the faster that they become deployed. And then the third that we're starting to see a lot more recently is really around energy security and in some ways sort of protecting consumers from a global energy market and the type of volatility and inflation that market can drive. And so what happens is that these 3 factors, they're all pushing in the direction of energy transition, but they're actually not independent. So as we know that one of the most effective ways of bringing down the cost of technologies is to deploy more of those technologies. And so as we've had governments that have provided support for low carbon technology deployment, we have, as my colleague said, we've seen the cost of those technologies come down. But this is sort of a really sort of cyclical force because, of course, as the technologies get cheaper, it becomes becomes easier and more affordable for countries and even individual companies to make more aggressive commitments to reduce their emissions. And so you get this sort of feedback effect of all three of these marching in the same direction and accelerating each other. And when I look at some of the signs of sort of being at that point, I think there's some that are far away from us that we can look at. So, in China last year, 25% of vehicles that were sold were pure battery electric vehicles. Closer to home here in Alberta, only just a few years ago in 2021, 8% of our electricity came from renewable sources. Currently, we have under construction enough renewables to bring that number to 28%. So in the span of 3 years, we've gone from 8% to 28% just here at home. And I think that really speaks to the pace of change that we can see. And there has, of course, been a lot of work going on. A lot of efforts gone into energy transition, but that was all starting from very small numbers. And we're starting to get to the point where those additions will start to, I think, be really felt within the broader energy system, which leads to some opportunities in terms of, we know that energy transition, electrification is really a story of efficiency. We can reduce our primary energy needs by 3 or 4 times, often by electrifying processes. But it also leads to challenges when we think about how those new energy systems are going to start to constrain and impact our existing energy systems. And so when I look at sort of what's coming next and what are those challenges, for the first time we're going to be starting to feel that. And sometimes those are physical challenges, so how quickly can we ramp natural gas generation in our power sector? But often before we get to the real physical constraints, we simply have market or economic constraints. So it's something that we can do physically, but we've set up our rules in a way that were designed for the historical energy infrastructure that has been around for going on 100 years now. And so we're going to have to really sort of think in a new way about the way that we design our markets, the way that we compensate different parts of the energy system to ensure that we get what we obviously need to continue to have, which is reliable, affordable energy throughout this transition.
Thanks, Sarah. And I think we'll come back to talk a little bit about some of the pieces that just happened yesterday and the impacts that we might see on our own energy transition here in Alberta. Before we get to that hot potato topic, I'm going to go over to Brian and get your perspectives from where you're sitting on where we're at and where you think we're headed.
Yeah, so we're living in interesting times. It's that blessing and curse. To me, the issues are very clear when it comes to energy transition. It is about scale and it is about speed. And we talk about this being unprecedented, the challenge before us, and that is really downplaying the scale of the problem. So the energy transition in Alberta, we are going to be off coal this year. That's awesome. That is years ahead of schedule. That is a very impressive milestone. And that really speaks to this narrative that we've seen, right, of global energy transition. But does it? There's kind of a bit of a false narrative out there that, we used to burn wood, and then we burned coal, and then we moved to oil and natural gas and biofuels, renewables, nuclear, etc. But that isn't actually how this has played out. In the early 1800s, 99% of our energy use came from burning wood, globally. Today, it stands at about 5%. But in absolute terms, we burn twice as much wood today as we did 200 years ago. Coal, yeah, locally, we are going to be off coal this year, and we should pat ourselves on the back for it. But humanity, globally, burned more coal in 2023 than ever in human history. And that beat the 2022 record, which beat the 2021 record. So we talk about energy transition. If you look at our sources of energy, none of our sources of energy on a global scale are even declining, let alone, they're not even plateauing. They are still growing. So the scale of the problem in front of us is immense. There's a lot of things to get excited about. We are seeing real step changes with renewables deployment, with EVs, the opportunities with hydrogen, we'll talk about later. There's a lot to get excited about, but the pure scale and the speed that we need to deploy at is unbelievable and a really significant challenge for this generation.
Thanks, Brian. So, hearing across each of you, I want to just pause and talk a little bit, although I told them, I did not give them any warning that I was going to ask this, so this is my favorite part about being the moderator, is you can You can plan for it, and then you can throw in a curveball. So we saw in the news yesterday the announcement of this shift in terms of imposing restrictions on renewables. And so lots of discussion in the media, lots of discussion I think we could be having here today. I just want to get a quick sort of your 2 cents from the panelists on how you think that's going to impact what's happening here at home in Alberta with our energy transition.
I can start and jump in. So I think there's 2 impacts, right? One is sort of the very direct local impact of how much further are we going to get. I mentioned we got from 8% to kind of 28 or 35 if you count all the projects that's been approved. The details of that I think still are a little bit outstanding, as we didn't really get a full picture on exactly what those rules look like. I think the broader question that it raises for me, though, is are we going to move forward in Alberta sort of making different rules for different types of energy, or are we going to create a level playing field? And so as I was sharing, I think earlier before the panel with my fellow panelists, in reflecting on those rules, and in particular something like the requirements for bonding and securitization of renewable energy projects on land, I think overall it's hard to say that that's a bad thing, right? I think governments have a responsibility to regulate industry and ensure that industrial actors are doing what they should be doing. The question then comes in, do we apply this rules to one specific part of the energy industry, that is, we require it only of renewable energy generators? Or do we also start to require actual real securitization across the entire energy industry, where we currently hold a little bit less than 1% in actual securities against the outstanding liabilities? And so I think this is a real moment of sort of decision for Alberta of, are we going to apply rules in a way that sort of punitively targets a specific sector, and particularly one that's related to energy transition, or is this turning over a new leaf of sort of applying stricter regulations across our energy industry? And for that, it waits to see what happens from the government on that file as well too.
Thanks, Erin. And for those of you who may not have caught the news, because there's just too much news to take in on one day, one of the big pieces of that announcement is a 35-kilometer buffer zone applied to any areas that need to be protected zones. And so the estimates have been hugely varied, with some saying that if that applies to all parks and protected areas, that would cover about 3/4 of the southern Alberta landscape. And so that would be essentially off limits to wind turbines and solar panels. So there's some interesting pieces in there. A big focus of the announcement was concern around the fact that renewables are, quote, intermittent and unreliable. So if you didn't have a chance, that's your Coles Notes version of it. But I'm going to throw it over to Brian. What was your perspectives on that announcement yesterday?
Yeah, so first of all, I work for a government-funded innovation agency. We are not a policy shop. But and I'm not saying that because I'm going to choose my words carefully. It's more that I had no knowledge of this coming. We've been watching it in the news like everybody else. Originally dismayed at the moratorium when it was enacted, understood the motivation, and I'll say pleased that it's being lifted, because it could have been extended. So that's a silver lining. I think for me, it's premature to judge exactly how this is going to play out in terms of those restrictions, because there's a lot of interpretation in the rules, and so we'll have to see how they get applied. Alberta was a leader in early wind and then solar development. We were overtaken by other provinces because of lucrative incentives, and then Alberta came back hard, and we have been leading the country in renewables for a while now. So we didn't kill the goose, I hope. There's a lot of projects that can now get going again. But yeah, I haven't seen, the news is very fresh. It's hard to judge exactly how many projects could be at risk or how much land will be sterilized. There's a lot of talk about agriculture taking priority over renewables deployment. For the most part, they can coexist. But again, the design of that and stakeholder management, there's a lot of factors in this. So it's a great topic to talk about, but I think it's, for me, a bit premature to judge just how impacted the industry will be.
Absolutely. And there's going to be a lot of, compounding factors if we talk about agriculture and the looming drought that we all know is happening right now and occurring this summer. There's a lot of factors to consider. There's a lot of issues on the table right now. Let's park that in the back of our minds for a second and recognize that that's still something that we're trying to figure out here in Alberta. And I'm going to ask Agri a question, looking a little bit more on the research side of things. So based on what you're seeing, how do you think we can help to accelerate clean energy solutions moving forward towards a more sustainable energy landscape?
Yeah, so policy, uncertainty, and other things aside, I think one of the things that has made renewable energy deployment advance and grow globally and also here is cost reductions. So the reason solar has been widely deployed, wind has been widely deployed, electric vehicles are being widely adopted is because there are significant cost reductions that are happening, that are taking place, that are causing this increased deployment. So on the research side, I think there's still need for research initiatives that are aimed at cutting the cost of most renewable energy technologies. And as I said earlier, solar reducing by about 80% was a significant thing, increasing its deployment. Batteries, the prices have also declined. So significant research and development in those areas, those technologies where there are still cost hindrances to deployment. Hydrogen, for example, is something that people are talking about in reaching the areas that are hard to abate, like heavy industry, oil and gas. But the costs are still high. So investing in significant research and development is one thing that is going to increase the deployment. Research in improving the efficiencies. Again, when you improve the efficiency, like for solar, you cut down on how much land you use, you need to deploy the system. So the efficiencies for solar panels have increased over the last 10 years from about 14% to now about 22%. And that is a significant increase. So that means less land required for a given output that you need. All that requires looking at the technical aspects of the deployment of the technology. It's not always the technical things that we need to look at. We also need to look at acceptance of the technology. What can we do in terms of research, socio-economic benefits, or the culture benefits of the system? How do we educate the people about these technologies that we need for transition? Public perception. If I can give you an example, I work more on building decarbonization using heat pumps, solar, and so on. But if you step out, people will tell you that heat pumps don't work in cold climates. And that is not totally true. It depends. You have to look at what is the public perception and how do we do research to address public perception and so on. So at the end of the day, the question is not going to be me sitting in my office and doing the technical things, improving the efficiency and so on. It's going to include how do we make sure that the research we are doing gets out there? How do we make sure that people get to know that these technologies actually work if it is things that can be used by individuals? How do we make sure that the research we do informs the policy that is made? So talking about the moratorium and also the land where we cannot put renewable energy sources. Renewable energy and agriculture can coexist, as Brian said, and there is an emerging research in agrivoltaics, which means that you can align your solar collectors together in your farm, support plant growth and so on, but at the same time generate electricity that you need. So things like that, how does policy and research interconnect for us to move forward in the energy transition are things that we need to be looking at.
Thanks, I agree. And certainly there's a lot of discussion on the community side of things, the society side of things. How does social innovation drive this forward? I'll just give you a little funny note before I go over to Brian, which was I was sitting in on a discussion on this topic, but it was more centered on the people side of things. And a senior VP recommended that big cultural changes require major, bold decisions. And his suggestion was that we rename the Edmonton Oilers the Edmonton Solar Panels. I want you to just park that. We're going to have a vote on it at the end. Not sure it has the same ring to it. I can tell you it went over like a lead balloon in the room, but I laughed, so there you go. Brian, I want to go back over to you because you spoke a little bit about, and I want to keep it on the positive. It's easy to talk about, what we're not doing well, where there's struggles and challenges, but let's talk about what we are doing well. Where are we seeing gains in reducing carbon emissions? How can we better support this big transition here in energy?
Yeah, so sorry to be the wet blanket at the beginning there. Just trying to park us in reality for a moment. But of course, what I work on day to day is really exciting, and there are gains being made across the board. When we've done energy systems modeling, I'm going to step on Sarah's toes a little bit here, but panels aren't really fun unless panelists do that a bit. We really see an all of the above solution. So we see virtually all the energy sources that are in play today are going to continue to be in play, but how they're being used is going to change fundamentally. And there's a lot of progress being made. You know, hydrogen is an example. Yeah, hydrogen is fashionable every 20 years or so, and it's back again, but this time it's back in a big way, and there's a lot of being deployed right now. Geothermal, we're seeing discussions around small modular nuclear reactors in non-nuclear jurisdictions like Alberta, in oil sands and elsewhere. There's a lot of really interesting opportunities, and maybe one I'd like to highlight is one we call bitumen beyond combustion. Right now, 95% of our bitumen resource, which is our oil sands, goes towards making fuels like gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, etc. And you know, the industry has been made improvements in the upstream, but most of the 80+% of the emissions come when we combust those fuels. Now, the oil sands is a very carbon-intensive molecule. So I'm not talking about carbon intensity of getting it out of the ground, but the actual oil sands themselves, that's what makes it, you know, this molasses sticky stuff, which makes it kind of a crappy feedstock for making fuels in the first place. But that's the way our industrial complex is designed, and that's where the demand is. But if we can flip this on its head and say, you know, instead of doing so much processing to convert this oil sands resource into fuels, we can instead convert it into materials. Materials like carbon fiber, like asphalt binder, like carbon nanotubes, activated carbon, graphenes, fullerenes. Our future is going to have a ton of carbon in it. This concept of the low carbon economy is a bit of a misnomer because around us is mostly made of carbon. The key is moving our carbon to materials. Carbon fiber is 10 times stronger than steel. So a lot of these materials are going to grow, and they need to grow in a net zero world. So we need to position our industries within Alberta to move towards where this net zero world is going. And I hate to be in Calgary and quote an Edmonton Oiler, but we need to understand where the puck is going, and we need to get ready to go there. And there's a lot to get excited about in the energy space right now.
Thanks, Brian. And it's the Edmonton solar panels.
Yeah.
You got that wrong. Great. Well, I want to throw a question out to the whole panelists here today, but I just want to remind those joining online to not be afraid to send your questions to this series of letters that you see on your screen right now, which is ssemc@ucalgary.ca. If you're feeling shy in the space here today and not concerned that you might not feel comfortable asking your question verbally, you go ahead and sneakily write that question to the email here today. No one will know. So we have a few minutes left for our panelists here before we open it up to Q&A. I want to talk a little bit about how we get everybody together on the same page. You know, everyone's picking up an oar going in the same direction. There's a lot of challenges to that. There's a lot of, you know, we can talk about the politics, but I promised at the beginning that we would try not to actively talk about the politics. We just recognize it's part of everything that we do. How do we get everybody moving forward in the same direction towards where we know we need to go, recognizing that this is such a complex and challenging issue? I recognize that that's not an easy question. I recognize there's a lot of players involved from the municipal, provincial, and federal side. But what are your perspectives on how we might be able to move forward and get everybody on the same page?
I can start and reassure people that there's actually more going on than meets the eye. As a provincial agency, we have partnered with our federal agencies at Natural Resources Canada, Prairies Economic Development Canada, on a number of different areas that we've advanced. So methane emissions reduction, another, you know, honestly, one of the rare targets that we're hitting early. We have reduced emissions by 45% since 2014, and that's been because of collaboration between the feds and the province. Similarly, we are co-investing together in hydrogen and in bitumen beyond combustion. So there's at the working level, there's a lot more collaboration than what you might perceive from the media, where there seems to be a lot of rhetoric that goes back and forth, which is largely unhelpful. But to reassure people that there's more alignment than meets the eye. Could there be better alignment? Absolutely. But there is a lot of common interest there.
Thanks, Brian. Others?
So I feel like if you're on a panel in Alberta and you don't quote Wayne Gretzky, then you should quote Peter Lougheed. So I'll go ahead and do that. as someone who's become an adopted Albertan, this is a lesson I think I've learned. But I think Premier Lougheed, in research that I've done looking at the work that he did in Aostra and really enabling the development of the oil sands, at the beginning of that work, he stood up at the Calgary Petroleum Club and told a room full of the conventional oil industry that the conventional oil industry is in decline, that we are producing our resources faster than we are finding new resources, and that will lead over time in the not so distant future to a declining industry. Not that that industry is going to go away, but that there was going to be less resources produced there. And that was the starting point for then this major investment in Aostra and push into a new sector. And I think we need to have a similar conversation today, which is not to say, and maybe we need to have it in a more open way. I don't think anybody can really predict what's going to happen, with certainty to global demand for oil in the way that a local resource is much more predictable. But I think there's very credible signs that energy transition is going to go as fast or faster as various predictions put forward that do see a peak and decline in oil demand in the coming decade. And so rather than, I think, fighting over, which forecast or which scenario we think is the right one, really one way forward in progress is to look across all of those reasonable scenarios and then understand, what does our economy in Alberta and in Canada look like under those scenarios, and what do we need to do to change that? And I think we haven't done that exercise. We do a lot of conversation, a lot of discussion about which one is the right one, but rather than trying to get it right, let's understand how we are prepared for all of these different potential futures, and then start to make a plan that ensures we have a robust economy, no matter which one ends up kind of playing out.
Absolutely, I agree.
It's good to hear that the provincial government, at least on the technical side, and the federal government are cooperating and working together. So promoting shared goals, I think, is one of the things that has to be done for us to move forward. I think the concern for us as a province is what we do with oil and gas, the jobs that it employs a significant percentage of the population, about 150,000 employed in oil and gas. So if we are talking about transition and we are saying we need to go net zero for the grid, no oil and gas, no natural gas, nothing, what happens to the jobs? So promoting the shared goals and realizing that there are other things that we can do to use our oil products for. Carbon fibers is one of the things, but converting natural gas to hydrogen is another thing that can help us move forward from just using oil and gas for transportation or for heating, converting it to natural gas and so on. So I think transparent dialogue between the different players is key, is important, and also promoting those shared goals. As a province, we care much about the jobs and oil and gas because that's where our revenue comes from. How can we make sure that we make it as clean as we can?
Thanks for that. And we're going to transition now to having some discussions here in person, and certainly some great comments raised already that should have fueled some potential questions for you in the audience. We do have some coming in online, so I'm going to go to online first. And the question comes from Miriam and asking, could the panelists comment, and I warn you, it's not an easy question, so just so you know. Could the panelists comment on the major bottlenecks in deploying energy transition and decarbonization at scale? How would lack of scale and a broken glass, how would lack of scale in deploying energy transition influence the public trust? What can be done to build such trust? So I think it's a great question that builds on some of the comments that you just said. Any takers to Miriam's question?
Well, I mean, part of the issue on the trust side is about energy literacy. I mean, a problem across the board is energy literacy in Alberta, in Canada, worldwide is pretty terrible. So I think a lot can be done, and I think fundamentally we're all responsible for that. We're actually working, for example, on a literacy campaign for hydrogen, because there's a lot of effort going into developing hydrogen, but if the public isn't willing to accept hydrogen into their lives, then it's kind of all for naught. And so we need that, clear consumer demand for these transition opportunities, and that's not apparent in a lot of places. People don't really want to disrupt their lives. I mean, a 15-cent tax for a bag has caused an uproar, let alone some of the very significant financial and behavioral impacts of the transition that we're talking about. So it is a big challenge, and deploying at scale requires an awful lot of capital, which is a problem to attract. and it needs a lot of people. And so we have, an amazing amount of expertise in the province, but there's a lot of retraining and reskilling that has to happen as well. So there are many technical and especially non-technical challenges when it comes to this transition and the scale that we have to move at.
Thanks, Brian. There seems to be a notion or a rhetoric that moving forward in the energy transition is naturally going to leave a lot of people behind, and that's a rhetoric certainly that's pushed through the media often, but that doesn't have to be the case, and it's not really what we're seeing on the ground, but there's a lot of divisiveness that's created there. Anyone else on that, on how we deploy at scale and how we build public trust?
Sure, I'll give it. Well, I mean, there's an academic answer to that, right? Which is, it's carbon lock-in and the mechanisms that kind of prevent us from deploying. We know comes from a lot of sort of different areas. So we have, a bunch of infrastructure that exists already. We certainly have, in the policy space, we have institutions that, in some cases, make rules, against deployment of new technologies. But often, just as much of a challenge is the lack of regulation or the lack of guidelines to enable deployment of new technologies. And so, really ensuring that institutions are, aware of and connecting with organizations like Alberta Innovates to understand what's coming, what do we need to be ready to regulate so that it can be built. And then the last one I'll say just on the capital, I mean, I think we've certainly seen a number of cases where there is, risk and investors perceive risk that may be higher than is actually there, whether that's a technology risk for a technology that is actually better understood than maybe the investment community sees, or when we start to talk globally. I mean, we can be happy about the pace of renewable development in Alberta. We know that in many developing countries, very high cost of capital prevents, similar deployment of renewable energy. And so there's a lot of roles for policymakers to find ways not to subsidize, directly these technologies, but to actually de-risk them and kind of take and hold that risk, especially in cases where, that risk is really more of a perception on the investor side than an actual risk of towards the capital.
And maybe I'll just add on to that. It's interesting, in the last 2 months, I've been asked by 3 different academic institutions to meet to talk about how they're going to overhaul their curriculum to start teaching to the energy transition. So it's amazing there's this recognition that, we need to stop talking about it in the abstract and start getting into the details of, okay, how do we run a nuclear industry? How do we run a geothermal industry? How do we run a hydrogen industry? And it's a great question, but it's also like, well, when is the right time to do that? Because none of those really exist today. It's hard to teach, but we can't wait until it's going to really introduce it into schools. So, again, it's the speed problem that we need to move really quickly into these areas, but when is the right trigger point to start reskilling and reteaching these opportunities? And those are just 3 of many examples.
Thanks, Brian.
Yeah, I'll just add on. In terms of deploying at scale, I think it's always going to be a challenge of the capital investment that you need to make in terms of transitioning from the conventional systems to the renewable energy systems. So I think cost is going to be a significant factor, and as Sarah was mentioning, it might not be providing incentives to make the technology cheaper, but it might be things like what can you do to reduce the cost such that the technology becomes cost competitive and widely used. In countries where they have had successes in deploying some of the technologies, for example, in Norway, where they have about 60% of their buildings on heat pumps, it had to do with what are the regulations that are in place, incentives, subsidies that the governments provide for the industry to shift from oil heating in homes to heat pumps. So cost is always going to be a big factor. I don't see a reason why I should change from a natural gas furnace that costs me only $10,000 to a geothermal heat pump that costs me $50,000, for example.
Thanks for that. Let's see if any brave souls in the audience. Oh, yes. I'm going to the middle there. That was the first hand up. Go ahead. We'll bring a microphone over to you.
Yeah, thank you, panelists. It was an interesting discussion and a balanced discussion, I would say. My name is Randy Latoon. I'm an energy consultant, graduated from U of C in '91. The one thing that I see happening is there's lots of talk about scale, lots of talks about renewable integration, lots of talk about new technology, and it seems to always come down to a supply and demand question. We need to get more demand to get the supply there. And I would argue that that's not the case. We spent decades building out infrastructure for natural gas, for electricity, which today we take for granted. We turn on the tap and it's there. We need infrastructure to facilitate the energy transition. People aren't going to decide to buy an electric car up in Hinton if there's no ability for them to charge their car. People aren't going to buy a hydrogen vehicle in Hannah if there's no infrastructure for them to fill up with hydrogen. So to say that we'll wait for the demand to get there to supply that fuel, it won't work. You know, we need our regulations and our funding to support the hard to fund infrastructure problem. Because we know as an industry, as an energy industry, if there's an arbitrage on a supply side, we'll squash that in minutes because we always are good at doing the supply. So we need to encourage people to want to use that new energy source and to have the ability to make that decision. So I would encourage everyone to think about infrastructure more so than just supply and demand. And I would maybe ask you how much of that is involved in what you've been working on.
So certainly from our side, you know, where we can use existing infrastructure can accelerate things tremendously. I mean, getting things built, new infrastructure, is awfully difficult. It used to be NIMBY, you know, not in my backyard, and now I joke it's banana, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone. It is really hard to build greenfield projects. Now, we have a carbon trunk line that is only 10% full, right? We can do a lot more in CCS without building a whole bunch more infrastructure. Hydrogen, we are using a hub approach. You know, we have an industrial complex in Edmonton that is producing hydrogen, and so now we have buses and trucks and trains all starting to move off of hydrogen as well. So it takes time, but there's a huge opportunity. And on the pipeline side, we have a lot of natural gas pipelines that we could start to blend hydrogen into in low concentrations. And that's a quick win to start to decarbonize. There are codes and standards issues, so there's some technical and non-technical obstacles to doing it, but absolutely where we can use existing infrastructure to accelerate, we ought to. We sometimes just need to get out of our own way to enable ourselves to do that.
Anyone else want to tackle the hot potato of the massive infrastructure gap in Canada?
Sure, I'll just say, I mean, on the infrastructure side and the EV charging side, there's some work that I'm doing along with colleagues to look at ways to use infrastructure that we have today to better meet that demand, right? So I think there's sort of a sense, I'll give one example, that, you know, if you're going to buy an EV, you need to have a 220 plug in your home or 240 plug in your home and have a level 2 charger, and, you know, that's a must-have. And so we've done some work looking at EV drivers across Calgary and find that actually the very significant percentage of drivers would be able to meet their charging needs with so-called trickle charging, so basically just that regular plug in your garage without needing to do any upgrades to your electrical infrastructure. Similarly, the question of, you know, what are we going to do when we get all these new electric vehicles on the grid? And, you know, if they plug in an uncontrolled way, that is a real challenge that we have to meet. But with a little bit of planning and some smart controls and managed charging, we find that people are actually willing to shift their, or really seed demand of when they're charging to the utility in exchange for a bit of funding. This is some work that was done by my colleague, Dr. Blake Schaefer. He likens it to, you know, people are willing to wait in line for a long time to save a few cents on gasoline at Costco. Imagine if you could save that by just saying, sure, charge my car when you want overnight and it'll be ready in the morning. And then electrification goes from being a challenge of we need to build out all this new infrastructure to actually being an opportunity to move our demand around. And that, again, comes back to basically planning for that, having those regulations and ensuring that these kinds of controlled charging are possible. So sort of moving from, you know, imagining that the only way to integrate these new, this new infrastructure, this new energy demand is by doing it the way that we've always done it. Sure, you can do that, but it's going to cost a lot more and it's going to take a lot more time.
Thanks, Sarah. A couple more questions rolling in online, but I did see a question here in the front. Do you still want to ask it, or? Microphone's coming at you.
I think we touched on it a little bit. I was curious from the panel from their perspective on timeline. There seems like this urgency, we need to do it tomorrow, but Sarah's example of Aostra is something that took decades, and Alberta Innovates has done great work on the bitumen beyond combustion, but again, that's going to take a lot of time. And similarly for energy efficiency and for homes, there's a lot of existing stock there, so it's going to take a lot of time to transition that. So I'd like the comments on timeline, maybe what's near term and what's longer term.
I have one comment on that. I tell my students in my solar class, you know, people say, well, we can't suddenly do this overnight, but of course the physical principle that is behind solar PV production was understood over 100 years ago now, right? So I think there is, when it comes to technologies that we're going to be able to deploy at scale in the next 10 years, it's very much those technologies that have already been developed. And we need to, of course, continue to develop technologies for the, 20, 30 years from now. But there is sometimes, I think, a false dichotomy of, oh, we either need to deploy what we have or we need to invest in developing technologies. And really, we need to be doing both at scale as fast as possible.
Yeah, again, it's all the above. I mean, you'll be heartened to know a year ago we were making carbon fiber strands in a Petri dish, and actually in my office I have a hockey stick made out of Alberta carbon fiber. That's pretty cool. I also have a truck mirror, so prototypes are starting to come out. But yeah, commercial production is still years away. The real opportunity right now is to deploy what's already de-risked. That carbon trunk line that's only 10% full, let's fill it and let's start doing enhanced oil recovery. It's a huge opportunity to put carbon CO2 into the ground and reduce the carbon intensity of our oil. There are a lot of other opportunities like renewables, et cetera, that can be deployed at scale right now as we continue to develop the hydrogen opportunity and the small modular nuclear opportunity and others. So yeah, it's an all hands on deck. There are no silver bullets out there, so it is an all the above solution.
Yeah, so for energy efficiency in homes, it's all a question of affordability, acceptance, and awareness. The technology is in existence. If you want a heat pump right now, you can go and buy it and install it in your existing home with some minor upgrades, probably to your distribution network and so on. So it's something, and the lifetime of a furnace is about 15 years. So there are furnaces that are due for replacement. So if someone, I've seen people come to me, ask me, my furnace is due for replacement. What would it cost me if I put in a geothermal heat pump, for example? And then what they are looking at is what is the payback period? And really, it's something that we cannot start to use if we are talking about transition to clean energy in home heating, because our gas is very, very, very cheap. So when you tell someone you need about 26 years to 40 years for you to break even for a heat pump, a ground source heat pump, then if he's motivated by the cost, if he's motivated to do something for the environment, then that's something that they can do. But there is progress that we can make if there's regulation in place. I gave an example in Finland where any new home that is built, you cannot put in an oil heating system. So by default, you have to look at what is the alternative that I can use. So because of that, they have been able to move faster and quicker. And I think 60% of their homes now, 40% of their homes are already heated by heat pumps. So in about 10 years, they're going to fully transition, because if the other furnaces are due for replacement, then they have to go to heat pumps. They can't do anything else. But of course, it has to come also with acceptability of the technology, and if there's pushback from people. I know in the US there are some cities that tried to do that, but then there was pushback against the regulation, and they had to back off. So.
Thanks for that. There was a couple questions online, and one of them relates to we often talk about solar panels and wind turbines, and that's where we stop having the conversation. But what about geothermal and nuclear? And each of you touched on it a little bit today, but how much do you think the Alberta landscape lends itself well to things like geothermal and nuclear?
I can start. So geothermal is a thing. It's not going to be a big thing. That's my bias, that there will be successful projects and successful companies, but fundamentally our temperature gradient and our rock in Western Canada is warm. It's not hot. We're not Iceland. We're not parts of California. So there will be some geothermal in our energy mix, and there should be. but it's not going to be a major source of baseload power, which is unfortunate because it's a great clean baseload power, and we know how to drill holes in things, and we know how to produce fluid. So we're well suited for geothermal. We just don't have the resource here at that scale. So part of the mix, but not a dominant one, in my biased opinion. Nuclear, I'm more interested in. However, the challenge there is really not on the technical, honestly. It's on the non-technical. It is all about regulatory environment and stakeholder acceptance. Nuclear is still the boogeyman to many, even though it is potentially a low-carbon, baseload opportunity. It is going to take more than a decade to deploy. Now, Alberta has really some great use cases. The oil sands, to be honest, is a great use case opportunity for nuclear. We also have Indigenous and remote communities that would love to be off diesel. So we have some really great opportunities for nuclear, but don't underestimate the time it's going to take to get the regulatory and stakeholders engaged, right? And that goes back to the energy literacy problem and aligning our environment. Now, the government of Alberta is really keen on exploring nuclear. We've signed a memorandum of understanding. Alberta Innovates actually leads the Alberta Modular Nuclear Reactor Consortium. So there's quite a bit of momentum right now, but it's still very, very early. So both geothermal and nuclear, I think, are going to be a thing, but at different scales and different timelines.
I can add on geothermal. I had a chance to work with Roman on drilling for geothermal and so on, and I'm still actively working on geothermal. Geothermal for electricity is going to be a challenge, but geothermal for direct use, heating and so on, is something that we can start to look at because, as I said, most of our energy that we are using goes to heating in most cases. So geothermal for heating, direct use is something that we can look at. In terms of the temperature gradients, we have very small temperature gradients. So what that means is that we have to drill deeper, much deeper for us to access the higher temperatures. And that is a lot of cost to do that drilling. Now, if we are lucky and the cost of drilling goes down, I think the Department of Energy in the US is targeting a cost reduction of about 95% cost reduction by 2030. If miracles happen and it happens and the cost reduces, maybe it is something that we can look at in some places, not in all places. There are some places where the gradients are better. In some places, maybe. So it is something. The good thing about geothermal is that you don't need acres and acres of land like solar, so you just have to go deep. So maybe that is a solution to the land use issues that the province is talking about.
Thanks for that, Agri. That brings us to the end of our time for the Q&A. I'm sure many of you still have lots of questions that you'd like to ask. Luckily for you, all three of these people are easily accessible by email. And I'm sure would love to answer some of your questions. What I want to do before I throw it back to our Vice Dean, Anders Nygren, is just to have you join me in thanking our panelists here this morning for their great remarks. And I'll send it back over to Anders for some closing remarks.
Thank you so much. So thank you so much, Carrie, Agri, Sarah, and Brian for hosting a wonderful discussion here this morning and providing your insights and expertise. And thank you to everyone in attendance here, both in person in the room and also online, for spending parts of your morning with us and for contributing the great questions that really helped us make the most of the expertise that we have on the panel here this morning. We hope you've enjoyed yourselves this morning and that you'll join us for the next edition of Schulich Connects on March 21st. The topic at that time will be neurodiversity and inclusion, the role of technology. So keep an eye on your inbox for that invitation. Until then, thank you again for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to this Schulich Connects, proudly sponsored by TD Insurance. We'll see you next time.